As someone with multiple citizenships all around the world, I'm often asked, how do you manage paying taxes in 5 different countries? That must be difficult. And this shows a common misunderstanding of how taxes and citizenship go together. So let's talk about how it really works. Here's some recent comments that we have gotten. Isn't it a pain to manage filing taxes in each country? Sheesh, that's rough. If I get a residence passport in Argentina, do I pay taxes there? Wouldn't more passports just mean more countries to pay taxes in? It seems like whenever our team looks into this, we don't always, but when we do, it seems that these folks are largely from the United States. And this is very interesting to me because I think most Americans don't understand that they effectively have the only country with citizenship-based taxation, which means that even if you don't live in the country, you still pay taxes for not living there. Yes, there are a handful of other countries where there are certain carve-outs where certain people who have citizenship might pay taxes without living there, but generally speaking, the US is the only one with kind of full-scale taxation. Now, what we've said before is you can use things like the foreign earned income exclusion, you can have set up foreign corporations, you can do a number of things to where, especially if you're an entrepreneur and you have a business, not a profession, and not passive investments, you can reduce your taxes to a pretty small number. And so for an American moving overseas, again, especially if you're in business, there's still a lot of money to be saved on top of the cost of living savings, on top of the extra freedom, on top of everything else you get by not living in the United States. But what's interesting to me is that Americans, there's almost this feeling in the United States that, hey, you're a citizen, you pay tax. That doesn't exist even in other high tax countries. And so that's why it's interesting that Americans are the ones saying, why don't you have to pay taxes in all these countries? Here's the simple answer, you don't. Because taxation is based on either where the income is derived from, the income source, and or where is your own personal tax residence. And so let me give you an example. I am no longer a U.S. citizen, but if I wanted to go and buy rental property in the United States, that property sits in the United States. And so I will pay tax on the income or other money I make from that property in the United States. I will file a U.S. tax return as a non-resident. Now, depending on where I live and all sorts of other factors, I may, depending on where I live, have to pay additional tax, or there's a number of ways that could work out. But for sure, the U.S. is going to say, hey, you own rental property here. If you're going to earn income from that, we'd like to get our cut. Doesn't matter if you live in the U.S. Doesn't matter if you're a U.S. citizen. That's where the asset is. Doesn't apply to everything. I mean, a bank account may not be taxed. Interest in a bank account may not be taxed in certain countries. Every country is a little bit different on every type of income that you earn there. But the idea that I don't live in the U.S., so therefore my rental income in the U.S. is tax-free, doesn't work that way. But the big factor that people don't understand is what is tax residence. Now, this, I think, misunderstanding comes about because the average person is born and lives their entire life in the country where they are a citizen. And therefore, citizenship and tax residence go together. If you're born in the United States and you spend your time living in the United States, I mean, you're going to be both a citizen and a tax resident. Now, the fact that you are a citizen makes you a U.S. person, and you're a tax resident regardless, but you're going to pay the full taxes, no exemptions, no exclusions, no whatever, for being overseas. Same thing if you're Canadian. If you're born in Canada, you can leave, you can become a tax non-resident of Canada at some point by going through an increasingly laborious number of steps that we help our clients navigate in places like Canada and the UK and Australia and others. But you can get out of the system. But if you're born in Canada and you live there, most people who are born in Canada are Canadian. Well, they all are, because if you're born in Canada, you're a citizen by birth. But if you live there, you're a citizen and a tax resident. But you can separate those two things. And so, take a situation like mine. Real quick, let's just cover on, if I get a resident passport in Argentina, do I pay taxes there? Not sure what that is. You can have a passport which is given to a citizen. Citizenship entitles you to a passport. There's a few different exceptions there, but citizens can get passports, basically. A resident passport, you can have a residence permit. Citizens don't need a residence permit. You're allowed to live in your country of citizenship. So that may be a misconception between residence and citizenship. Both allow you to live there. One has more permanence. One may have more obligations or benefits as well. But take me. Okay, you remove the U.S. passport from the equation, which I did. I'm a citizen, for example, of St. Lucia in the Caribbean. I've never lived in St. Lucia. St. Lucia does have an income tax. Not all of the Caribbean countries that offer citizenship by investment do. through freedom of movement in what's called the Caribbean community, I could go and live in one of the ones that does have no taxes. So if I go and live in St. Kitts and Nevis, I'm entitled to do that, and I wouldn't pay taxes, and I could live there all I want. And I would then be a St. Kitts tax resident, but not a citizen. And I would be living there, basically that would be my residence and my tax residence. And they don't happen to apply taxes, so therefore, as long as you remove the one country in the world that taxes you no matter where you live, just because you have their citizenship, the US, I, as someone who holds multiple non-US citizenships, can go and live in St. Kitts and not pay tax. However, if I choose to go and live in Italy, and I qualify as a tax resident due to spending enough time there or maintaining connections, or every country has their own criteria, I will be sucked into Italy's tax net. Now, Italy has different exemptions. If I've never been a tax resident before, I can pay a flat 100,000 euros a year, and that's all I have to pay, and I can keep the rest of my assets and businesses offshore. But if I don't do that, then I'm going to pay tax in Italy. And some of those countries have exemptions, but not all of them do. I mean, if I move to France, let's make it even worse. They have no tax exemptions. You move to France, you just pay and pay and pay and pay. So once you become a tax resident, you don't have to be a citizen. You could overstay a tourist visa in some countries, and you could be roped into the tax net. And that's why, living nomadically is something that even if you do so as a tourist, it can be dicey and requires proper tax planning. It's one of the things that our network of experts that we hook people up with, help people do, make sure that you don't trigger tax residence when you don't intend to if you're traveling to different places in the world. And so I've never lived in St. Lucia. So therefore, I was never a tax resident of St. Lucia. St. Lucia does not have citizenship-based taxation. They have a residential tax system. So if I live in St. Lucia, I pay taxes in St. Lucia. If I don't, I don't. And I could go and live in St. Lucia for some period of time and then decide to leave. And when I leave, as long as I follow the criteria, which I think are easier in St. Lucia than, let's say, Canada, then I'm out of the system and I can be out. And so if you look at all the passports that I have, one or two of them may have some sort of favorable tax regime, and I have spent time living in those places. I don't know that because I was always traveling around that I ever became tax resident. And so therefore, because I didn't become tax resident, I didn't pay. One thing that's different in the emerging countries that we often talk about is they have more flexible tax residence rules. And so a lot of emerging countries will have a simple days test, the 183 days, or sometimes it's 180 or 181. If you spend that number of days in the country, you're a tax resident. If you don't, you're not. Whereas more developed countries have added additional tests. Does your wife live here? Do you own a car here? What are the other ties you have to our country? And you could get roped in on those even if you don't spend the requisite number of days. Or there's a lower number of days you're allowed to spend before you get roped in, depending on how many ties you have. Again, every country's a little bit different. What we do see is countries, again in the West, are making it harder for you to become tax non-resident, but that's not directly tied to citizenship. Now, I did say that Australia is moving towards some kind of de facto backdoor citizenship-based taxation last year, in that if you're a citizen and if you've paid tax there, and if you leave, and if they don't like the way that you're living overseas, they may elect to tax you. It's certainly not as much black letter law as the United States is, but they're basically saying, hey, your passport is kind of a strike against you. And, if you're traveling around without any kind of permanent home, we don't really like that, and maybe we should tax you. And we'll see how that will be applied. Other countries, like the Nordics and even Mexico, say, hey, you got to go to certain countries on the nice list for a couple years before we totally let you out, or else we're going to hit you harder. I wouldn't call that entirely citizenship-based taxation, but it means that it does disproportionately affect citizens. You can go to Mexico and live there and pay taxes there and then decide you want to leave, and you're going to be at a disadvantage of whether versus living in Ireland for a while and then deciding to leave, where it's more straightforward to get out. And so the bottom line is I have citizenships in countries where either I don't live at all or I don't live long enough to trigger the tax residence rules, or if I ever did, it would be in a country where I had, let's say, an exemption from certain, permanent establishment or controlled foreign corporation rules, where I can run my business and maybe I'll pay tax on my salary, but the business isn't roped into the tax net as the business. Because if you own a business, your business may be sucked in, right? So this is why Americans can't just set up their company in the British Virgin Islands and keep living in the United States and not pay tax. Well, because they're living, and as the owner of the business gets sucked into the net as well. as well as just by having people working there. So you're both the owner and the employee in that case getting sucked in. So if I were to live in a country of citizenship and I were to trigger tax residence, generally by spending 6 months or more, I would have that be a country that had more favorable taxes, to where maybe I would pay something, maybe my salary would be taxed, as I said, but my entire business network would not be sucked in, because even if you were willing to pay something, there's been a couple countries that said, okay, all your offshore companies, pay us some amount a year, and all right, we'll call it good, because we don't want to bother collecting. We don't think you'll tell us anyway, and there's been some emerging countries where like, just pay us a fee, and we'll just keep your business offshore. That avoids the paperwork. One of the problems that a lot of Americans don't want to be American anymore is that okay, hey, you can pay as little as zero, and for many people now single digits or thereabouts, as an American entrepreneur overseas. But what happens when your business gets as complex as mine is, and you've got staffing companies in different places, and you've got all kinds of different companies around the world? You've got to file forms for all those companies, and some of those jurisdictions don't play nice with the U.S. law, and so it's like you're doing stuff that they don't understand. That's sometimes worse than paying. But the bottom line is you pay tax where you live. Here's where I do pay. I do have a tax residence, and I pay some income tax now. I have a certain amount of control over what that is, and it's based on money that I move around rather than what I'm earning. So I can kind of predict going into the year, here's what I'm going to pay in tax. And okay, I did pay zero for a number of years because that was what the lifestyle prescribed. And I never was tax resident anywhere once I left the United States in those years where I was still spending fewer than 6 months in any one place. In the UK, I think last year about a dozen people volunteered to pay more tax. I think in the US, it's about 100 people a year. Very, very few people are volunteering to pay tax they don't owe. I lived a lifestyle that took me all around the world. I didn't owe for a number of years. Now I'm a bit more settled, and for a number of reasons, set up a tax residence. Okay, I will pay something. And you know what? It's more than a lot of people pay. But it's a very reasonable percentage, very, very reasonable percentage for me. And so I will pay that. Fortunately, I also, unlike the US, I get to choose a place where the tax return, I saw the tax return for the first time. I said, this is like a joke. This is the tax. It kind of looks like a child's, like a school project or something almost. Like, this is the tax return? So, yeah, this is the tax return. And so it's easier to fill out. It's simple. One of the speakers at Nomad Capitalist Live this year is the former president of Estonia. They made it so everyone can file their taxes in 5 minutes. And they've been quoted by some of the presidential candidates in the U.S. Why don't we do this? Why don't we make it easy? Well, that's not really what the U.S. stands for. It doesn't stand for making paying taxes easy. But the former president of Estonia will be speaking at Nomad Capitalist Live. That's why I recommend these countries, that even if you're going to pay something, make it easy for me. Don't loom large over me. Let people have some kind of control over what they're going to pay. So a lot of these tax residences, even some in Europe, Italy, pay us 100,000 euros, we leave you alone. Make 100 million if you want. Give us our 100,000 euros. That's what we want. Anyway, that's how my personal income tax situation works. We have businesses around the world. My advice generally is if you want to live somewhere that has tax, keep the business somewhere that's tax neutral. We largely do that, but we have employees in various places around the world. Sometimes we do use what's called EORs, employers of record, where someone else employs your people. I'm not the biggest fan of that. Hatia, our HR, talks about that on the Nomad Capitalist R&D channel. She's done some episodes on that. But we have, in some cases, our own staffing companies where to pay our people and to have them on the proper payroll. We have a company, and we'll pay a little bit of corporate tax there, a de minimis amount, and we'll pay payroll tax. And so that's, in some countries, that's a big chunk of tax that we pay as a company, a lot of tax, not necessarily based on our orders, but we can control, okay, what does payroll cost every month? And what's the percentage of tax we pay on a blended basis across the world on that payroll? If you increase revenue, the tax doesn't necessarily increase, but you're still contributing to those various countries. And so that's generally what we'll pay on. Some other people might pay tax if they have some kind of like payment processing. There might be a separate structure for that with some minimum tax. But the bottom line is control. I choose where our business wants to conduct business, where we want to hire people and how we want to have them hired, where I live. And there's a certain amount of flexibility. If you understand every year what you're gonna do. During the pandemic, our business took off, and yet I still had control over what the tax would be. Back then, it was essentially zero, other than these staffing companies. But I knew what it was. And even if your revenue triples in 1 year, having control over what that bill is going to be, because it's based on levers other than your income, is important. And so I think that the residences I have and the citizenships I have define that. But again, you may pay taxes where you've got a rental property. You may have no connection there. You're going to pay taxes if you run payroll through another country, and sometimes that may be you set up a company, a special purpose company, just to pay that payroll as part of your global group of offshore companies. You may have no connection there. You may also use that to get a connection. So if you hire people, one place we have a team is in Armenia. You can get a residence permit in Armenia on the basis of having a company and having an employee or two. And so you can see how having control on the tax side is beneficial, but also looking at opportunities where you might have employees or pay taxes, where you can plant other flags, get a residence permit, even get a citizenship in some cases. So it's kind of a circular system. This is what we help our clients figure out. I'm a big believer in doing things legally. I think that if you're from the US or some European countries, it's easier to do business in most places. Maybe not some countries in Central Africa or something, but a lot of the places that we talk about, it is easier to handle paperwork. It is easier to file taxes. The country's government looms large much less. I think that if you experience what it's like to get out of your country's tax net, live around the world, have a couple of passports, you're adding optionality. Could some country decide to tax people based on their citizenship? I think a few Western countries could. Do I think St. Lucia is going to do that? No, I don't. I don't think they have the means. I don't think they have the desire. And so that's how I pay taxes in all the countries that I have citizenship. And the answer is you don't have to. It's based on other factors.